I thought I would start with a couple of comments about the contemporary situation. I think you may want to mark upon your calendars the date of September the 18th, because on that day there was an attempted financial coup against the people of the United States, orchestrated out of Wall Street with Henry Paulson, the lead man at the Treasury. And I really want you to think about that as a financial coup. It was held back because some of the Wall Street Democrats, like Charles Schumer and so on, wanted a piece of the action. And so now, instead of the Treasury Secretary having complete control over $700 billion with no oversight and no possible legal inquiry about malfeasance or anything, instead of that we do have an oversight board and a few things like that. But the big question is, does this whole thing make any sense, and how did it come about? And I want to make just a couple of remarks about how it came about. There's been a massive crisis in the United States property market. It's called a subprime crisis, but I want to change the language of that. It's an urban crisis. And actually, if you go back in history, you'll find a connection between urban crises and financial crises going back some considerable time. The one that I think is most relevant to this city is what happened back in the 1970s, when, in effect, the investment bankers did a financial coup against the democratically elected government of New York City, put the city into receivership, made CUNY charge tuition, raised fees on all sorts of things, and demolished a lot of the services upon which the mass of the population depended. And as I commented about this in one of my books, this financial coup was economically just as efficient as the coup in Chile by General Pinochet, who after a couple of years of military dictatorship imposed upon Chile a whole kind of neoliberal regime. So that was another example. Now, the point about this is to put a certain perspective on what has happened and what we might want to do about it. In effect, capitalism has one huge problem. Capitalism is always generating surpluses. And it does it for a very simple reason, that if you kind of want to think about what a capitalist does, they start the day with a certain amount of money. They go out into the market and they buy means of production and they buy labor power and they put it to work in a production process and they create a new commodity. And then they sell it at the end of the day for more money than they started out with. A healthy capitalist economy is one where all capitalists are doing that, which means there has to be more at the end of the day than there was at the beginning. And the big question is, where does the more come from? Then there's another interesting question, which is, what do capitalists do the morning after with the more they got yesterday? If they were sensible people like you and I, they'd just consume it, have a good time. But they can't do that because they live in a world in which they're disciplined by what Marx calls the coercive laws of competition. And if they don't reinvest in new technologies, new products, they soon won't be a capitalist anymore. So as a result of that, capitalism has been characterized by a compound rate of growth ever since the middle of the 18th century. And this poses a certain kind of problem, because a compound rate of growth, when capitalism was really confined to about 20 square miles around Manchester, is one thing. When you start to think about a compound rate of growth, when you're talking about the United States and Canada and Brazil, and you're talking about all of Europe and Japan and China, you wonder, where the hell is it going to go? Now, historically, one of my arguments has been that actually a lot of the surplus has been absorbed through building cities, through urbanization. Give you one example. The great slump of the 1930s was a situation in which capitalists couldn't find a way to use the surplus. They couldn't find profitable outlets, and so we had a collapse of the economy. World War II solved a lot of that, because then there was a wonderful way of using the surplus in military expenditures and killing people and all the rest of it. But then the big problem was, after World War II, what would you do with the surplus? And the answer, very simply, was build the suburbs, suburbanize the United States. Massive investment in highways, but not only that, housing, and with it a transformation of lifestyle. So you're talking not only about housing and highways, you're also talking about refrigerators and lawnmowers and, you know, drapes and all the rest of it. So that you're absorbing the surplus through that urban process. Now, that all came to an end at the end of the 1960s, and that is when we got this big crisis of the 1970s. And interestingly, the big crisis of 1973 was led by a crash in global property markets, which was shortly followed by a rise in the price of oil because of the Arab-Israeli war. Interesting parallel. And as a result of that, all kinds of fiscal difficulties came into the urban process, and we had this disciplining of the whole urban process in the 1970s with, in effect, the financial takeover of New York City government, the disciplining of municipal governments around the country, the disciplining of many other governments through organizations like the International Monetary Fund, structural adjustment, and all the rest of it. So there's a certain pattern here. But when you get into the 1990s, there are various other ways in which the surplus starts to be absorbed through the technical bubble, through the high-tech bubble and all the rest of it, the 1990s. And about the middle of the 1990s, you start to see the emergence of another bubble, which is the housing bubble. That is, a lot of money starts to go into housing construction. And then the big question arose, well, how are you going to pay for it? Who is going to pay for it? And given the politics that began with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and all the rest of it, which was effectively repression of working class institutions and organizations, and repression of working people, and the neoliberalization of everything and the financialization of everything, real incomes did not grow. Now, how do you pay for housing if real incomes are not growing? Well, the only way you can do that is to go into debt. So we get the emergence of the debt economy, big time in the 1980s, 1990s. The amount of household indebtedness has increased from something like $40,000 to $120,000 in the last 30 years. It's tripled. So people go more and more into debt, and they save less and less in order to pay for this boom which is going on. Now, what that says straight away is that if there is a crash in the market, one of the reasons for it is the failure to actually pay decent wages, decent incomes, because if people had the incomes, first off, they wouldn't go as much into debt, and secondly, if they were into debt, they'd be able to pay it off. So we had this debt economy, which was becoming increasingly shaky. And in order to guard against it, the financial institutions decided that they would try to spread the risk. And what they did in spreading the risk was, of course, to come up with all these crazy innovations, innovations upon innovations upon innovations. And they started to create entirely new markets, markets which didn't exist before. Credit default swaps, currency swaps. interest swaps, all kinds of crazy markets. Those markets took off big time. They did not exist in 1990, but by the year 2006, those markets accounted for the circulation of something like $280 trillion. $280 trillion. Now, just to give you a sense of what that means, if you add up the gross domestic product of the United States, Canada, all of Europe, Japan, and China, you would get $32 trillion. So you have 8 times the actual product is circulating through these crazy markets which didn't exist in 1990. Everybody knew on Wall Street that that could not possibly last. And if you go back and look in 2002, Warren Buffett wrote a piece where he kind of said, this cannot last. It's crazy. And Wall Street, however, was building those fictitious markets, building markets upon markets. You insure debt, and then you insure the insurance of the debt, and then you insure the insurance of the debt. That's what the sort of thing that was going on. Most people on Wall Street recognized, I suspect, that while they were making a lot of money out of this, a huge amount of money out of this, that it was likely to come crashing down. And the only interesting question was when and how. It could have happened 4 years ago. If it had happened 4 years ago, it wouldn't have been so bad. But now it's happened. But if you look at the structure of the problem and how it came about, then this starts to tell us the sorts of things that we should do with those $700 billion. We should not give it to the financial institutions. We shouldn't take up their debt, their toxic debt. What we should do is to take that money and to take it into neighborhoods of the cities where the debt foreclosures are going on, where in effect, when you look at what's happening in Cleveland or you look at what's happening in Baltimore and places like that, you have in effect a financial Katrina, which is hitting low-income neighborhoods, African-American neighborhoods, hitting particularly badly on single-headed household women in particular. What we should do is to take that money into those neighborhoods and ask municipalities, step by step, to revitalize those neighborhoods, take care of the foreclosures, and actually revitalize the urban infrastructure. We have a lot of struggles with urban infrastructures right now. Now, at this particular moment, it's really very interesting because the other aspect of the other tsunami that's coming, if you want to call it that, is that municipalities are beginning themselves to experience a fiscal crisis because property taxes are falling, their finances are falling, so actually municipalities are beginning to cut back, even in this city, which has been less hit up until this point than cities like Cleveland and Detroit are laying off people, reducing services. And this is exactly what happened in the 70s. That is, you use your power to go after those people who are least privileged, have the least possibility, in order to preserve the class power of the very affluent. And that is roughly where this bailout is headed right now. And it's one of those ironies that I find myself in alliance with the right wing of the Republican Party in saying this bailout should not go through. Not in this form. There is another way to do it. Now that then raises the other question. If we're going to think about this as an urban crisis, then are there ways in which we can start to think about the urban as a site of revolutionary movement? Now, 40 years ago, a book came out called The Right to the City by Henri Lefebvre. There are many people now who are rereading that book, because also what happened in 1968 was also very much an urban movement. It was about the neighborhoods in Paris. It was about the quality of life in urban regions. And by thinking about the right to the city, you can start to say, we should be able to take back the right to the city. And this right to the city is not an individual right of access to the city. It's a collective right to change the city in a radically different way from what it is. This city of New York has been transformed under the Bloomberg administration into a developer's paradise. Manhattan has been turned into one of the most affluent, gated communities in the world. Not by putting gates around it, but by simply raising the rents and the property prices to the point where it's very, very hard for ordinary people to live here. So the right to the city then is a right to transform it. And on that, there's a wonderful statement by an urban sociologist in Chicago who said this, that the city is, in effect, the place where we have really tried to make the world more after our own heart's desire. But in making the city, we have created an environment in which we're henceforth condemned to live. So, in a sense, without even being really conscious of what we're doing, in remaking the city, we have remade ourselves. So the right to the city is about remaking us, remaking social relations, remaking environmental relations, remaking political structures, remaking the physical fabric, and in so doing, remaking ourselves. So one of the big questions, which actually I see being asked in different ways, particularly in the arts communities, is to ask the question, not simply about what kind of city do we want to live in the future, but what kind of people do we want to be? And by thinking of that as a dialectical relation, what you then start to think of is an unfolding of politics. An unfolding of politics that takes us in a radically different direction. Now, it so happens that some of us academics have been thinking about right to the city as a motif for our work. But at the same time, there are social movements around. There is a national social movement called Right to the City. There is a Right to the City movement here in New York, a coalition of different groups, because different groups against gentrification or in defense of public housing or in favor of democratizing spaces in the city, these different movements are all beginning to recognize that you just cannot get very far on a single narrow objective. We need a collective movement. And that collective movement can be pulled together around this theme of the right to the city. And this was something that Henri Lefebvre pointed out back in 1968. He basically said, the theory of revolution has to be urban-based or it will be nothing. If we cannot transform our cities, we will not be able to transform the social order and vice versa. And it is that connectivity that it seems to me we should all be thinking about on a grander scale. And as we think about it, we need to be able to articulate what is wrong with being forced into this incredible attack upon the welfare of the whole of the population of the United States in order to prop up a few financial institutions. The fear that we're constantly faced with, the fear of terrorism, now the fear of financial collapse, the politics of fear is really being used big time, and we have to find a politics of hope to go against it. And that politics of hope, I would suggest, could well be articulated around this idea of the right to the city. Now, in Brazil, there is a right to the city movement there. They even have a statute now, which is called the Right to the City Statute, as part of the Brazilian Constitution. I had an email 3 days ago from a group in Croatia, which is about the right to the city. There have been meetings in Sweden on that theme. In other words, this seems to me an appropriate moment both to reinterpret this fiscal crisis which we're going through as an urban crisis, and then to confront it with an alternative approach to the urban issues through the theme of the right to the city. Thanks very much. We usually debate, right? We usually debate.
What's that, sorry?
We usually debate.
No.
No?
There's no debate.
No debate.
It's all speech, but I mean, do you want some questions or something?
Yeah, why not?
All right, this is going against our, well, this is how it works. Democracy works in terms of David Harvey gets what he wants, because of course it's best. Does anybody get any questions for David Harvey?
Okay, the question I think is about the rural, and here it's kind of interesting. One of the things that Lefebvre also pointed out is that the distinction between urban and rural is essentially now a false distinction. That they're so integral to each other that you cannot deal with one without dealing with the other. That, in effect, the countryside has been absorbed into the city, and the city has spread into the countryside. And there are movements, for instance, one of the movements that was key in the formation of the Right to the City statute in Brazil was the MST, which is the landless peasant movement, which is rural-based, if you want to call it that, but is increasingly operating in the peripheral zones of Sao Paulo. So I take the question is over the, I'm not arguing that simply about, the urban. I mean, for instance, where does New York City begin and where does it end? There are people working in New York City who live in New Hampshire. There's a lot of second homes, and, the kind of integration of the urban and the rural is very, very important to look at. And I think that what Lefebvre was talking about when he was talking about eventually, this is the reason he switched his language from the city to the idea of the right to produce space in general. And it is therefore the production of space and spatiality. But I think the right to the city encompasses very much that aspect of politics as well. Yeah.
Is this thing on? Oh, yeah?
Hi. I'm so glad to have been here to hear you speak, David Harvey. Thank you very much. But I just wanted to address the fact that that a lot of our public spaces that we consider to be, the street and areas or spaces that we consider to be public are actually highly policed and surveilled, and also considered, I guess, to be privatized. Like, where can we actually find this this place in the city that we can take back?
Well, we have to make it. I mean, people never give you things, you know. You have to fight for them. I mean, that's part of what the struggle is about, and I think part of the struggle over public space. And yes, indeed, I mean, when you look at the way in which, for instance, they're re-engineering Washington Square and all those kinds of things, it's absolutely appalling. Public space is increasingly being, as it were, put under a disciplinary apparatus, and even when people are allowed to be there, their surveillance aspects are very strong. And a lot of this, of course, is being set up by these business partnerships which start to take over. I mean, look at the way in which the Central Park was taken over by the Conservancy, which is a private institution, and which then can decide that we can't have a big demonstration there at the Republican National Convention because the grass is too delicate. You know, these are the things we have to fight for. And I think that the more we can fight for them, and it very often is going to take you know, real political struggle and sometimes physical struggle to make that happen. And I don't see any option right now except to try to take back the city, and bit by bit by kinds of various struggles of this kind.
Any more questions?
I think it's a beautiful idea to have artist space like this. I think this is a rare opportunity. But we're so low on the Maslow's pyramid. How do we get to the point where we can all eat so then we can have art? Or do you see that as a contradiction?
How do you mean that we all eat? I mean...
I lost my job last week.
Yes,
that's a good
right.
example.
Okay, yeah. This is, again, one of the things that has gone on over the last 30 years through the neoliberal assault, if you like, has been precisely about bringing a lot more insecurity into the job market, generating much more in the way of unemployment and all of those kinds of things. My point was there was a class assault from the 1970s onwards to bring about a situation in which people like yourself and the mass of the population could not benefit at all from the rapid increases in productivity that were occurring in a capitalist society, which is then the only way we could benefit at all was through going into debt, which is not a good idea. Again, some of the issues here are about the macro politics that we have to engage in and we have to think about. I find it very distressing that we don't have an articulate left in this country that can articulate, as it were, the requirements and the needs of the mass of the population. I thought it very interesting during the Democratic primaries that the more the primaries went on and the more the candidates were forced to deal with the conditions of the people, the more their rhetoric, at least, moved a little bit to the left. The problem is it almost certainly won't stay there unless we have social movements that can keep it there. And one of the big problems in this, again, has been the individualization. This comes back to the, it's a very interesting phenomena. What did suburbanization do to political attitudes? People started to think about, just their space, the value of their home, keep other people out, not in my backyard. Very conservative politics. The urban was creating a new kind of suburban political subjectivity. And in the same way, the transformation of urban life over the last 30 or 40 years into niche markets and all the rest of it, and individualistic, do-it-yourself kind of situation, means that, in a sense, the collective notion of a city, the collective notion of a body politic that can actually collectively do something, is very hard to reconstruct. That is the task that we have to think about. And it's going to be a long-term task. I mean, I wish I could get your job back tomorrow, but but it is a long-term task which we have to think about in terms of what our future cities are going to be like and how that future is going to be about the kinds of people we are. What I find very interesting, particularly in situations of this kind, is that many people are trying to identify entirely different sets of social relations and insert themselves in various ways into the urban around those social relations or those different definitions of social relations or environmental relations. In other words, there is a sense, a struggle going on which is a bit subterranean. What it is lacking right now is the articulation of all of that ferment which is going on in these different places and different times. I mean, I meet groups all over the place who are doing fantastic kinds of things. The problem is to somehow or other articulate it, bring it together so it becomes a much more of a mass social movement of the sort that did indeed change things, for instance, in this country, like the civil rights movement of the 60s did, to try to push on a more collective kind of way towards a different macro politics. Because right now we have one political party called the Republicrats. It's actually operating more and more on the Chinese model of a single state apparatus with different internal factions fighting each other, sort of governing over a crazy capitalism which is constantly supporting. And again, it's, as it were, trying to see the world through a different set of lenses and to be able to see the politics of it more clearly. And I think, for example, this subprime crisis, the way it's set out is, well, there were some evil people around who did evil things. And, oh, yes, we're going to send the FBI in now and arrest a few people and send them to jails just so, you know, everybody in the population feels better about the situation. It's not a problem of evil folk doing evil things. It's a systemic problem of the nature of capitalist development. I mentioned the fact that capitalism is always producing surpluses. At the end of the day, we have to control the surpluses, not them. Just think how nice it would be from them. They wouldn't have all this anxiety about what to do with their surplus the day after, because we just take it away from them, so they could sleep well at nights. And in fact, there have been some very interesting plans and ways to do that. And of course, during the 1950s and 1960s, a significant chunk of the surplus was being taken away by the state and being used to support education and healthcare and all those kinds of things, well, and all the rest of it. Wasn't the best system in the world. Lots of criticisms to be made of it. But at the end of the day, until we control the surplus, we're not going to be able to get to the heart of this particular problem. Otherwise, we're going to be faced with this issue I mentioned at the very beginning, which is a compound rate of growth for the next 300 years. What would that look like? As it is, growth is stymied, real growth is stymied, and so we get fictitious growth of this sort that we've seen in this financial catastrophe. And now, of course, there's an attempt to take it out on us. And that also has to be understood. So these are the questions, if you like, that seems to me to have to be put up on the agenda. And I feel as frustrated as you do in the sense that, you know, how do we get these ideas out there? How do we get them moving? Difficult. But we have to try. Raised fees on all sorts of things and demolished a lot of the services upon which the mass of the population depended. And as I commented about this in one of my books, this financial coup was economically just as efficient as the coup in Chile by General Pinochet, who after a couple of years of military dictatorship imposed upon Chile a whole kind of neoliberal regime. So that was another example. Now the point about this is to put a certain perspective on what has happened and what we might want to do about it. In effect, capitalism has one huge problem. Capitalism is always generating surpluses. And it does it for a very simple reason, that if you kind of want to think about what a capitalist does, they start the day with a certain amount of money. They go out into the market and they buy means of production and they buy labor power and they put it to work in a production process and they create a new commodity. And then they sell it at the end of the day for more money than they started out with. A healthy capitalist economy is one where all capitalists are doing that, which means there has to be more at the end of the day than there was at the beginning. And the big question is, where does the more come from? Then there's another interesting question, which is Wall Street Democrats like Charles Schumer and so on wanted a piece of the action. And so now, instead of the Treasury Secretary having complete control over $700 billion with no oversight and no possible legal inquiry about malfeasance or anything, instead of that we do have an oversight board and a few things like that. But the big question is, does this whole thing make any sense, and how did it come about? And I want to make just a couple of remarks about how it came about. There's been a massive crisis in the United States property market. It's called a subprime crisis, but I want to change the language of that. It's an urban crisis. And actually, if you go back in history, you'll find a connection between urban crises and financial crises going back some considerable time. The one that I think is most relevant to this city is what happened back in the 1970s, when, in effect, the investment bankers did a financial coup against the democratically elected government of New York City, put the city into receivership, made CUNY charge tuition. I thought I would start with a couple of comments about the contemporary situation. I think you may want to mark upon your calendars the date of September the 18th, because on that day there was an attempted financial coup against the people of the United States, orchestrated out of Wall Street with Henry Paulson, the lead man at the Treasury. And I really want you to think about that as a financial coup. It was held back because some of the Wall